It's good to be back, isn't it? On the Pitchy and Palscast, here with Matt to talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Before we dive in, how you been? It's been a while. Obviously, life happens sometimes.
I've been pretty good, and I've been excited to get back into this because, I think we've gotten through most of the not so great movies in the MCU, and so we've got such interesting ones to go through. And this was actually kind of interesting to watch these ones that we did. So I've been pretty good.
Cool. Any other interesting things before we get into Marvel stuff? Any other fun stories you want to tell? Exciting experiences you've had? You know, general parasocial bond forming for the audience, small talk. Buy our shit.
I have been playing Sekiro, which I have mostly quite enjoyed. We talked about how much we enjoyed DMC5, I think, last podcast.
Yes, we did.
And I think I've been quite lucky now to these two games that I've played. I've played DMC5 and now Sekiro, where both have very, very good combat systems. One maybe not as good as the other, but when you're talking about DMC5, you're talking in the very upper category of
Also particularly extreme paradigm that's very difficult to adjust to in different contexts when you're then playing something else.
Yeah. But, if you do give yourself the time to do it, I've really enjoyed Sekiro so far. And so if you have the chance, I would definitely give it a go. And that's really what the most fun thing that I've been doing has been Sekiro, definitely.
Yeah, I got home last week. I got home at about 3 a.m. on Friday night / Saturday morning because I was at a gathering which played a bunch of Sekiro and then watched virtual YouTuber Kizuna I playing Sekiro as well, which was some very good new media content, trademark. As for things I've done in this time period, there's a couple of follow-ups to that last episode. As a follow-up to my complaints about racial coding in Ant-Man, I saw the Lego Movie 2, the second part, which was still written by Philip Lord and Christopher Miller, but not directed by them. And that certainly showed in the way that the editing was in particular. But what was neat was the way that it intentionally played into villainous coding around a black woman in it, in order to make a point that she wasn't a villain, and maybe you should think about the ways that we use shorthand and stereotyping in order to obfuscate the message that people in minorities are actually saying, which was really, really cool and nuanced to have in a children's movie. As a follow-up to that Devil May Cry 5 point for me, I saw the film Mortal Engines, an incredibly bland, boring, shitty movie which managed to simultaneously be a cynical attempt to adapt an older book into the aesthetic of a current-day young adult's dystopian novel like a Divergent or a Hunger Games or a Maze Runner. You forgot about the Maze Runner, didn't you?
When people say post-apocalyptic YA, you think of Hunger Games and then you think of Divergent and then you just forget the rest, and then when you remember them, it's oh yeah.
Oh yeah, there's that also ran. Yeah, so I was trying to crib on them, also very much trying to crib on Star Wars. I was expecting to just have this resting irritation while watching this movie with a friend who suckered me into watching it purely because they just needed a steampunk fix, even if the steampunk fix was bad, and it was definitely bad. But what escalated my resting tedium into genuine frustration and anger at the movie was an hour into the two and a bit hours of its runtime. Suddenly, an extremely gay-coded Asian woman appeared and shot slavers in the head with a shotgun, then stabbed some other slavers in the head with blades that were in her shoes. And it's just, you gave me Bayonetta as a character, and you didn't make the entire movie just Bayonetta kills imperialists headed by Hugo Weaving? Why am I not watching that movie? Why does it not exist? I'm stuck with fucking Tip Top and Wonder White as my leads, when I could be watching something that's actually cool.
It's always more frustrating when you get a glimpse of something that could be better rather than nothing at all.
Yes. Yeah. That true greatness makes you further regret the time wasted.
And I was reminded of Bayonetta a few times in the second movie we watched, so there's a little bit of nice little circular things happening there.
Synchronicities coming.
Yeah.
So let's just dive into this, shall we? We are up to this week Captain America, Civil War, and Doctor Strange, no subtitle. Do I just call it that for the rest of the episode?
Yeah, because it is so weird to see these ones without subtitles now. So yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's the first time they've... Well, I mean, it was only 2 movies prior to Doctor Strange that Ant-Man happened. So it feels like there's been a lot, but there hasn't. And I guess that's a starting point for me, where I didn't watch Ant-Man, as I said last time, because Avengers: Age of Ultron made me so bored and irritated at this series. And then Captain America: Civil War was the one where I decided to go again, which felt like a really, really long gap, but it was honestly only about 8 months, because these movies come out all the time. But it was definitely a better change of pace than Avengers. I guess we should get into the plot summary first before we talk about Civil War more.
Yeah.
So who's going to do that?
I think probably might as well be you. I think especially because, I don't know, for some reason I just have a feeling that you might do a good job with this one.
Okay. So Captain America: Civil War begins much like Winter Soldier, with a Bond-style mission in progress. There's some bad people who are planning to break in and steal a bunch of viruses. So they're stealing some sort of disease from a disease research center in Nigeria, so it might be possibly even just a strain of Ebola or something. It's utterly irrelevant to the plot. What matters is bad people are doing a bad thing, and the Avengers, rather than S.H.I.E.L.D. this time, is the group that's there to stop them. But the setup is very similar to Winter Soldier, where it's just you got this squad, they're doing the communication, they're setting up things, scouting out people, trying to do it all covertly. Operation mostly goes off fairly well. They beat up the bad guys a bunch. They keep the collateral damage basically minimal. The only damage is to the facility by the bad guys, which is kind of hard to prevent because it's a surprise attack. And then, unfortunately, things go awry when Scarlet Witch Wanda tries to Gal Gadot this explosion. She tries to use Eraserhead on it and just propel an explosion upwards into the air so it's safely dispersed without hitting anyone. But she has a bit of a slip of the hands, and it winds up knocking the explosion into an office building, severely damaging it, and probably killing lots of people accidentally. And this serves as a bit of a straw breaking the camel's back, as far as diplomats are concerned. And so the Secretary of State for the United States approaches the Avengers with a set of proposals that's being put forward by about 117 states of the United Nations, dubbed the Sokovia Accords as a nod to the events in the fictional country of Sokovia in Age of Ultron, saying, okay, there needs to be some checks and balances in the Avengers. It needs to actually be under the jurisdiction of the United Nations, rather than an entirely solo operating thing with no checks and balances, and is also probably a component of the United States forces. So we're going to ditch that. You got to work for the UN. There's going to be a bunch of checks and balances. There's going to be an approval process before you can actually do any operations, and that'll be good. And Steve Rogers and Falcon are not very, very happy with this at all. Nor is Wanda, though she isn't at that meeting.
Well,
I'm trying to remember who else is at that. Who's at that
initial
meeting?
At the meeting? Yeah, like,
yes.
well, Black Widow's at the meeting, Rose is at the meeting, Vision, and that's basically a lot of them. I think it's like,
Put a pin on Vision in this scene. We'll get back to him later. And so there's this bit of a tiff. Tony Stark being the main spokesman for the favor of these accords because he's feeling a lot of guilt about the fact that he made a genocide machine and then could have potentially made a second genocide machine in that same movie. Okay, I've been avoiding the music for a while, but I think I'm just going to play Genocide Machine from Super Robot Wars F at the start of this episode and see if anyone gets the joke. So, Captain America is not happy with this situation, and he's invited to go to the signing and ratifying of these accords at a UN meeting in Geneva in a few days' time, but he decides not to go. He's had it with this. He's just out. He's going to fume for a while and start to develop a romantic relationship with the niece of his previous romantic relationship, which is just as stale and lifeless as the previous one was on screen. Then, at the ratifying of the Geneva Accords, there is a bombing attack, which winds up killing the king of a small African nation called Wakanda. Put a pin in Wakanda, we'll talk about it in like 2 weeks' time. And so there's a big bombing here, which is bad. The son of the king, who's now of King T'Chunka, one young Prince T'Challa, is very, very, very angry. It looks like Bucky, the Winter Soldier, was the one behind the bombing. He is going to murder the Winter Soldier. He makes it very clear that he
doesn't say he's going to, like, arrest him or anything. I'm going to kill him.
I am the king of a sovereign nation. If I want to kill this fucker, I'm going to do it, is roughly what he says. And then Captain America, now that he's not got any actual job, he decides to go and track down Bucky because, of course, Bucky was showing signs that he's not being mind-controlled in the previous film. They start to have a bit of a conversation, but the German police are moving in, as well as Iron Man and the rest of the Avengers are also trying to move in, as well as one mysterious figure in a cat costume who wants to really, really murder this guy. It is revealed by the end of this action sequence that it is in fact T'Challa. Surprise, surprise. They get captured and brought in by the police, who then basically don't, strictly speaking, put them under arrest. It's just, okay, you're in this cautionary room, we're just gonna work out what's happening, what's going on. In that time, while Bucky's in solitary confinement, an interrogation's supposed to take place by a United Nations approved psychologist. However, that man has in fact been murdered and replaced by a rogue man with connections to Hydra, who turns out to be a former Sokovian Special Forces agent, who has acquired the book of the command codes to reprogram Bucky's brain, which he's using to secure the information that will let him find the other secret soldiers from the Winter Soldier project. There's 5 other people. I guess we should put a pin on this, but basically it's an irrelevant plot point. It's just a means to find ways to force people to go to places, is essentially why it exists in this film. So Captain America's all, I've got to go stop this, I've got to stop these other Winter Soldiers. Tony Stark's all, I've got to bring you in because you're a rogue vigilante and you're violating many, many, many sovereign borders with your actions. So Captain America gets him a bunch of people to try and help him break through and acquire a jet which will get him to the location in Siberia where these soldiers are. Iron Man then in turn grabs a posse and they have a big fight in an airport, which is a nice, safe place in which there's stuff to smash but also no people to kill. However, in the middle of their fighting and struggling around, which manages to get Captain America, Bucky, just those two, into a jet to get off to Siberia. Then, unfortunately, War Machine's back gets broken in the middle of this fracas, which is the first real hero casualty that we've had in the cinematic universe so far, and they're all very sad about this. Tensions are high. Everyone who's with him... There's this subplot I haven't mentioned and we'll get to, but yeah. Meanwhile, Scarlet Witch was being surreptitiously confined in the Avengers headquarters, and Vision was trying to convince her to just say that's okay. Wanda's been busted out by Hawkeye and has joined the Captain America posse for this fight. At the showdown in Siberia, it turns out that the rogue former Hydra agent has actually killed all the Winter Soldiers, because his main goal throughout this all was just to really, really make sure the Avengers hate each other, with the implication that if he can tear apart a symbol of what appears to be American military might at this point, that will help to try and instigate political unrest in America. That's the implication of his lines, though the film does a bad job of really exploring that concept. But basically, through circumstances, Tony Stark gets very, very mad at Steve Rogers. They fight a bunch. Steve and Bucky leave. Black Panther has the opportunity to murder the ex-Hydra agent now that he knows that that's the real problem here, not Bucky. But he decides to just send the guy to prison anyway. And that's basically how the film ends. Just a bunch of people are in prison, though they're about to get busted out by Captain America. A super secret prison. Put a pin in the super secret prison because there's some shit there. And so yeah, Captain America's in a bad mood, but he's rogue. Iron Man's in a bad mood. Everyone's in a pretty bad mood, and that's basically the note the film ends on. Also, Black Panther's doing some stuff.
Yeah,
It's a really, really, really weirdly flat ending to actually describe an outline like that, isn't it?
I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to do the description, just because they're are so many twists and turns. Like usually when I try and do a plot synopsis, I try and like compact it as much as I can. But I feel like with this one, even if not all the plot points go anywhere, they're all kind of important at the moment that they happen, if that makes sense. There's like all the little twists and little turns in the movie tend to be important to describe. Otherwise, the next thing that happens sounds ridiculous or dumb.
Yeah, this is a film which was actively described by the Russo brothers as the first film to really, really require you to have seen most of the MCU up to this point for it to be comprehensible. And it really is, in some ways, a real highlight of the triumph of having this sort of cinematic universe concept. And this, because this really feels like just an episode of a serial series. Just here's a bunch of weird, messy stuff that happens that isn't really a cohesive 3-act story structure, but it does lots of interesting ideas and things and makes you more interested in seeing what's going to come next. Yeah. And that's absolutely the feeling I had leaving the cinema. It was, okay, I can watch these movies again. They're going to do some interesting stuff, maybe.
Yeah. I'm mostly very positive on this film. I think watching it again, we saw a few little complications, but I think what struck me on this second or third rewatch is just how engaging it is for the most part throughout it. It's just always interesting to see what is going on and where the characters are throughout the movie, and also I think what's really good about it is the fact that you're thinking about some of the larger issues, especially at the start of the film, and you're debating with yourself like which side is right or what should be done here between these two sides. And then after a while, you're also interested in, and after all these movies with these characters, the more personal developments that kind of develop later on are also very interesting, and I think that's probably
it's
what.
It's funny because I think really the only one who's really, really, really had development here, like Steve Rogers' development is still very little about his personal life because he has no personal life. He lives for his job. And so the attempts to try and build him some new relationships here fall utterly flat to me.
Well, I would say that. Well, yeah, that I mean, even if the romantic relation was good, I'd still hate it. Just the idea of the fact that he's like sleeping. Oh, well, he doesn't sleep with her, but the idea that he's developing a romantic relationship with his like other girlfriends, and only girlfriend, actually, I believe, niece is just very. To me.
It's okay. Like I said while watching, it's to draw parallels between him and Tony, because Tony really, really, really wants to fuck Spider-Man's arm.
No, just ew. The whole thing is ew. But I don't know. I feel like, I think what was interesting in a wider way to me is the fact that because the film starts out mostly with the characters stating their like wider beliefs in terms of like Tony wants them to have checks and balances, and Steve is worried about how that might affect their ability to function and to protect people. That's essentially what they're saying. But I think that the movie gives hints at the start at showing like, yes, they might have these beliefs in general, but they're actually like, they come from more personal parts of who they are. Like Tony has all that guilt. And with Steve, I get the feeling that, especially with, I think it's kind of overshadowed because it happens very early on in the film. It isn't talked about very much, but he loses Peggy right at the start of the movie. And that is kind of the last thing he had in his old life as Steve Rogers in 1944, 45, whatever. And I feel like you're seeing, even though it's much more obvious with Tony that he's spiraling and that his guilt is starting to become overwhelming and that he's just like... Robert Downey Jr. is fantastic, I think, in Civil War. I think.
Oh, in every movie, he is. I don't think we've stressed enough just what a freaking great actor Robert Downey Jr. is. Yeah, and that's why he was known for doing art housey movies before this all happened. Like this is fairly late in his career that he became Iron Man and got to get these super big roles and have this complete renaissance.
Yeah, because didn't he? I don't really care that much about actors' personal lives, but I think he had some drug problems, I believe, when he was younger. So good for him. But yeah, he's fantastic in this film, as he has been in all the films in the MCU pretty much. But I think Steve as well is in kind of a bit of a spiral as well. Like
Steve's hurt and he's lashing out.
Yeah, he doesn't know what his role is still. Like he thought it might be with S.H.I.E.L.D. Back in Winter Soldier, and that clearly went very, very poorly. And now he's thinking maybe it's the Avengers, and it's just not working out. And I feel like that is almost the point with Rogers, that even though that you could say it's flat in that he doesn't have much personal development,
I
but
didn't
he
get
doesn't.
to finish the thought.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, his personal life is not particularly well fleshed out beyond this grief, but his professional life, which is really like the identity of Captain America, is the identity he cares about most, and that's the one which gets explored the most thoroughly here. Not Steve Rogers, but Captain America.
And it's interesting because it does actually kind of link into what has always been kind of like the core issue, like with Steve, of like he has these views on the world that, while initially seeming quite brave and courageous and like good in a very traditional kind of way, you see how in Winter Soldier you see how that was like used by Hydra and twisted by Hydra, and now in this one we're seeing how even without an external evil force, just the complexity of the world means that his idea of just like see a problem, fix problem is, while like it's, I'm trying to think of the word here,
Admirable in its purity.
Yeah. It's also got its challenges. And I think that's great. I think it's great how you can talk about with this movie, you can talk about like how intervention works and who has the right to exert their will on the world and stuff like that. But you can also talk about just very, very much more micro or personal kind of ideas of like, how do you go about trying to fix problems? And yeah.
I was thinking a lot about a thought experiment that tends to be introduced fairly early into political theory, the ticking time bomb problem, which is a problem which is basically you're in a position of power, you've received intel that a bomb is going to go off somewhere in a densely populated place. You have someone who apparently knows where the bomb is. Should you torture them to find out where the bomb is? And it's a thought experiment which is very much geared towards, in its framing, to get you to say torture is okay. And so the question you need to be asking, first of all, is why is torture okay? Like, how can you be certain that torturing someone is going to do it? Will torturing someone actually get you the correct information in time? Are they just going to lie? What are the ramifications of if you actually torture someone? Do you then have to suppress all information about what you're doing? There's lots of questions which can branch out from it. And I was thinking about just that initial framing and how it's biased towards pushing you towards a specific answer with the ways, because there's the attitude of who is right, Iron Man or Captain America. And the Russos kept saying, yeah, we wanted to make this movie really have all the fans discussing who's right as they leave the cinema. And what interested me more watching it again, because this was only my second time seeing it, is not so much who's right, but how does the film try to frame it that Captain America is right, if we assume that he's not right. He's not right. And that's what really interested me. So, like I've said in the previous episodes, that Civil War is essentially Avengers 3. Yet the film straight up is billed as Captain America 3, which inherently leads you towards thinking, even though... Yeah, like this film just straight up pushes you, even though the first Avenger that you see is Iron Man in the film, which tends to push you towards thinking of him as the protagonist. The film's branding pushes you towards thinking of Captain America as the protagonist. And the ways that it frames Captain America and the scenes, the people, like he's the underdog in that initial conversation. There's only one person on his side, and there's like four on Tony's side. That tends to push the audience towards thinking that, well, Steve's right here because less people agree with him.
The speech that Sharon, the niece, gave about
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's this speech by Sharon, which is like the film's thesis statement in a nutshell right there. There's in that boardroom conversation as well, there's a bit where Rhodes says, "This is the UN we're talking about," which has this really strong implication that, you know, the United Nations is this really strong, powerful entity that can do all sorts of things and has control over other states and possibly over you. This doesn't reflect the United Nations in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it sure as hell does not represent the United Nations in the real world. It's a really remarkably powerless body in many, many situations. Essentially, if you've got a seat on the Security Council or you have strong military alliances with people who are on the Security Council, you can get away with all sorts of shit. But in order to create this sense that the UN might be bad or the UN is controlling things. It needs to put in these sorts of lines and this framing to get you to think that the Sokovia Accords are going to do more than they probably actually would. And that's all interesting to me.
Yeah, it's that thing where it's difficult to know without more information, because like even though they talk about the Accords a lot, because it's like kind of the casus belli of the whole fight, it's not really explained very thoroughly, and I understand why not. I mean, it's not really
it's a superhero / spy movie where people get sad at the end.
Yeah, it's difficult to formulate too much of an opinion either way without knowing exactly what the Accords really were, and
which is in itself interesting, like movie magic trickery. That you can use these emotive hooks and these tricks to not only make you agree with something, but to get you to think that an idea is good, but also to try and spark that emotive core, so that way you'll be willing to get fired up and argue over a fictional thought experiment in a world with superheroes that isn't actually detailed in a way that's worth discussing.
Yeah, I think a problem that I have is that because I'm a pretty big fan of the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they kind of go into things a little more thoroughly and a little in a slightly different direction as well, and that can, once it's in your brain, it's in your brain. So like once I'm watching it, it's like,
yeah, you can't unsee it.
Yeah. But I think actually you do see the reason why I bring that up as well is just saying that it impacted on how I view things. It feels as well that there are like almost two aspects to these Accords, and there's the main one obviously is the Avengers themselves, in that there are going to be checks and balances on what situations I guess you can interfere in. I guess that's like the main part. But I feel like there's also like little hints at how that is Accords are going to view people with powers in general, or people who are different in that world, which is very different obviously in the MCU because you have people with literal superpowers. Like, and I think that's where it's funny that in the end, the best arguments for Steve, at least that I can see off the top of my head, are actually not even with him, like, are not what he argues, or he's not even in the scene when they happen. And it's usually the stuff with Wanda, where you feel, wait a minute, maybe these Accords actually might not be the best thing, at least in their entirety, because you get a lot of stuff where you feel like Wanda is being kept in a kind of internment, and they're trying to convince her, almost gaslight her into like, no, you stay here. We don't want you to leave. And you get the feeling that people like her might be negatively impacted by such an official way of like, no, you need to sign these Accords if you have powers, and you wonder where that could lead later on.
And it's a really interesting one, because the implication throughout those all is that they're protecting her from bad things that will happen outside, which implies that these Accords are going to be written in such a way that they propagate an idea which will allow for new forms of systemic discrimination against minorities. But the text never actually demonstrates examples of that happening in society. It's entirely a case of people who are in positions of power using it to exercise their authority over this woman who's also a minority, which in turn leads to this idea. So it's like, you could maybe argue that it's going to cause that, but at the same time, that's also an argument being used essentially to justify greater degrees of state control over certain people and denying them their personhood, which is very interesting.
And that's where, like, the vagueness of the Accords kind of are a bit of a shame, because it's difficult to, like, you can go in any really direction with it depending on.
Which is also a good time to bring up a point about legislation in the real world, which is, this is why it's so important. And this is why real world legislation takes so long to get done most of the time. It's because you need to be...
That was a very thick document they came up with very, very quickly.
Yeah. Like, you need to be very, very careful with the language you use, because once that's in law, then the ways that that language can be interpreted can have really, really drastic circumstances. This is why, say, a lot of bills related to tech get really heavily scrutinized, because if you're ambiguous with your tech wording, then you can wind up with situations like, say, a data retention and mass surveillance bill that was implemented in Australia has such ambiguous wording that what was supposed to be only a few government institutions having access to this in emergencies has now allowed like 150 private companies to just access everyone's browser history.
And, this is you can like the law usually lags behind new developments, right? Like
Always.
in reality, and
Yeah, because it takes time and requires exploring the complex nuances of life.
and in here we're kind of replacing tech with, I guess, the concept of superheroes in terms of the MCU, where we have governments trying to scramble in order to try and make sense of how to deal with a world where you have people with such power and such an ability to... I mean, especially because they've done so many good things as well as the bad, right? Like, they've saved the world on a number of occasions, and it can be this difficult thing of, like, you want to yoke them under your control because of how dangerous they are. And like, they said so many examples, right? Like, in the opening scene of this movie, right? They cause a lot of damage despite the good they were trying to do. And you have Sokovia,
And
of
that
course,
time
being the
that
big
Tony
one.
Stark made a genocide
Made a
machine.
genocidal-
Genocide machine goes here.
But then on the other hand, they also kind of saved the world from annihilation a few times. And it's like, how do you navigate that situation?
Yeah, what is the causality and the correlation here?
Okay, we're gonna...
Oh, all right, so let's talk about fucking Vision. Piece of shit red man. Piece of shit robot fucker teleport through walls. No respect for people's personal boundaries. Fuck this guy. Can't even cook.
I was really surprised at how bad he was in this film. I'm not saying like his character was bad as in poorly written, but like as in like he's very, very fallible for a robot in this.
All right, so I think I should go with the position, the framing that I was going in and developing while watching it with you this time, which is that the Vision, well, he does contain the Mind Stone, an extremely powerful Infinity Stone that mostly gave him the power to have a brain, but he was still first a computer, and while computers, it's very easy to say it's zeros and ones, it's purely objective, it just takes data and does things. The data that you feed systems, the data that, like, the decisions made and what data you choose to give into systems will have an impact on what sort of results that they give. A classic example would be, for example, automatic hand dryers, which don't respond to, say, people with dark skin, because they haven't actually got the data to acknowledge that those are skin pigmentations that exist and belong to people. So yeah, Vision is a supercomputer man derived from a computer made by Tony Stark. It's going to have the biases of Tony Stark as its starting point for how it sees and understands the world. And so we go from there to this red fucker making the most insane logic jumps that you'll have in any conversation of philosophy and ideology in this film, where he starts off with like the basics of realist political theory that, you know, people are going to operate in their self-interest and this tends to create wars as an inevitability, which then leads to these really weird jumps where he's like, oh, well, without accords, there's catastrophe, is basically the jump he makes.
Yeah, he basically says that the Avengers are the reason why the events that he's basically saying that
it's
the
like
rise...
because superheroes started to happen, that instantly forces supervillains to exist, and that creates catastrophe.
Like it's such a dumb idea. Like it especially because like a better one is so easily found there, in just that maybe that the world is changing and that these kind of people with powers and the technology leaps that is needed for that is happening, and where the world is changing, hence we're now having different kind of events, like say aliens attacking, like say demons and wizards and all that kind of thing. But somehow he decides, and it's maybe this actually is a thing where he comes from Tony Stark, he makes it all about them. It's like, this must all be happening because of us, not because the world is changing, not because of anything wider. No, it's because we're really strong, so I guess people hate us.
I'm trying to think of, let's say, it was around the 1920s that a bunch of states started to put in, say, greater legalization of gay marriage. And so you're basically, it's almost like you're doing the leap of, well, gay marriage was getting legalized around that time, and the Great War happened around that time. Therefore, recognizing homosexuals creates world wars.
It's almost a cliche to say at this point, because it's like something, it's that thing that people who are trying to be clever kind of just say, even but it doesn't make it less true. It's just something that is so obvious now that it feels bad to even have to say that that whole correlation does not equal causation rather thing is definitely on top of my mind here, where he's just seeing he's just seeing two events happening and he's just putting them together without any kind of more thought at all. And it's just such a dumb thing to see a robot do. Or anyone do, really. Like, anyone who has a functioning mind should be able to do better than that. And I think what makes it more frustrating is that everyone gives him such... they give him such gravitas, right? They give him such authority. I mean, like, he picked up Thor's hammer, right, in the Age of Ultron and is, like, considered to be this ultimate machine a few times in that movie. So to give him such reverence...
Yeah, there's just a bit of messianic imagery with the Vision in that film. Just a bit.
So there's like, they give him such reverence, and then for him to be so dumb. Like, that's the word that I'm really... It's dumb. He's very dumb. Which I guess maybe Ultron was right. I feel like he was having a go at Vision for being, like, naive and silly in that film. Maybe he had a point. David Spader was right.
I mean, he was right. Like, he apologized for cutting off Andy Serkis's arm after all. But yeah, that in turn highlights something where different texts in the same continuity made by different people are going to have different interpretations by those creators, and thus move things in ways that you may not expect based on previous writers. And then that brings up, well, how do you engage with that? Because there's certainly an attitude that was very much... In some ways, I feel that, like, say, early Red Letter Media videos have a lot of influence on this approach of, well, this thing is bad, therefore we'll disregard it. And that you can then say, well, the Russos just didn't get Vision, and so you can just ignore everything he says if you thought that he was way cooler in Age of Ultron. And that, I feel, is a somewhat harmful way to be looking at texts and art, in that you then start to not look at what things are actually saying, what things are, but rather you're operating on a construct that is just picking and choosing what it wants rather than what's actually there. So it's like, we've seen, hey, he's this kind of smart guy when it comes to dealing with the big killer robot that has the same hardware as him. But when it comes to nuanced political topics, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's a goddamn targeting AI for Iron Man's suit for four movies before this.
And maybe that's okay. Like, I think
it's good that he's such an idiot. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it might be better if the movie, or at least some of the characters, called him out on it even a little bit. Like, I think in some ways it's okay for characters to be dumb as long as the movie understands that they're being dumb. And I do sometimes wonder whether the movie does. And at least it definitely seems like none of the characters seem to work that out. I remember, like, there's a scene after he knocks out Rhodes and unfortunately breaks his back in an accidental laser thing. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I got distracted. And Tony Stark's like, what? Does that happen? And you can tell that everyone is kind of operating on this idea that he is just kind of like...
You're the world's best targeting AI, man. You got a freaking Mind Stone in your head.
But yeah, it
made the stone change color, dude.
And once again, one of the best arguments on Steve's side is not Steve at all. It's once again, it's Wanda's story, and it's also Vision being so dumb, and by the fact that Vision is on Tony's side, it feels like Steve's getting
guilt by association there.
Yeah.
yeah. I do wonder, and this is why I'm just happily going with this interpretation of the full text. Like, I don't want to say that this means that you just don't... I'm not quite sure the wording I'm going to use there, but basically, this is where death of the author type arguments, I think, are more valuable than auteur arguments. Particularly because when I think about... Like, the Russos didn't talk much about Vision at all in the commentary for this film. But I'm thinking about the ways that they talk about, say, characters like Thanos, where I think that they have a very bad view of that character, which is what leads to a lot of the harmful framing that Infinity War had around him. And so, like, I think it's probably just they genuinely thought that they were making him have some cool, clever, logical contributions to the argument here. And so it's like, no, like, just reading this guy as being an idiot, being extremely naive and foolish and utterly inexperienced in the realm of politics makes sense. But also a lot of the people in that room aren't politicians. It's like Steve Rogers is a soldier. Black Widow is a former KGB turned CIA turned SHIELD turned Avenger agent. Rhodes is a soldier. Like, he's still straight up a soldier of the United States military at that point. Tony Stark is a scientist turned billionaire philanthropist. So he's not particularly... Like, he's all about doing his own thing there. He's not actually really paying attention to politics. Who else is in the room at that time?
The Falcon.
The Falcon?
Another
Soldier.
Yeah.
So, like, they're not people who are going
Wanda,
to have...
who was born, like, in
Wanda,
some...
who is, like, 17, I think she's supposed to be.
And yet I would feel like she probably has one of the better perspectives on things just from the fact she's not born.
She's not a soldier.
Yeah, she's not a soldier and she's not American. Like, obviously neither is Black Widow, or I guess Vision. That stuff.
Vision's American.
Yeah, but she's like born.
He's got a British accent, but he's American. I mean, I would argue that he's straight up an American citizen if we assume him to be a sapient species, and like he was born in America.
Well, that's a whole nother story, right?
Does his birth certificate have its father, Tony Stark, mother, corpse of Tony Stark's computer?
Like, the rights of, like, cybernetic organisms are, like, have enough complexity for entire stories themselves. So.
And I'm just reminded of a discussion I heard in a podcast once about the Frosty the Snowman animated short for the 60s. It just says, okay, before we discuss this, we need to qualify that, like, as an entity, Frosty the Snowman has no legal rights as a sapient being, right? Because he's not a human. Correct.
But yeah, I would just say that probably Wanda probably has one of the better perspectives just because, like, she's not from that side of the world. She's been brought up in a very different... She was brought up in Sokovia, right? Like, and that gives you a different perspective on how the world works, which might be useful for... But I definitely... And I think that kind of... what you were saying before, like how everyone is inexperienced and a little bit dumb in this with these kind of political and wide-reaching matters. And I think that whether it was purposeful or not, I think that does kind of connect with the fact that even though almost everyone in this movie starts out saying things in a very matter-of-fact manner, and they would say something like, I believe that this is wrong because of like wide-reaching reasons, like say like Tony's like, we need to be held back before we do more damage, or Steve's like, no, we can't have... Like, it's our responsibility to do this, and we'd be shifting that responsibility on other people who we can't really trust, or in general, we can't do our jobs of protecting people, right? Like, so they're having like these far-reaching kind of arguments. Mm-hmm. But then as the movie goes along, you start to see that all of them have very personal reasons for doing this, and I think that is interesting. And I like the idea of like kind of peeling back layers of, you start out with what they could be almost saying thesis statements, even if they're bad or good. That's kind of up to us to decide. But then it always comes down to just who are they as people, is defining how they're going to go about these wide-ranging issues, which I think is interesting and fun and very human, I think.
My favorite example of the weird confusion and muddled mess that every character goes through is in the second round of conversations between Captain America and Iron Man about whether he should sign the Accords, is that Steve starts off the scene, like Tony Stark brings in with this very, very symbolic bit of pressure of, I've brought along some pens. They're the pens that were used by America when it signed the military alliances that brought it into World War II in 1941. And Steve Rogers makes the most angry, barbed comment, which is interesting because Steve Rogers was extremely pro-America, supporting the war in World War II. And like he makes these really, really snide comments that scream of, well, actually, I didn't think America should have entered that war. That was the wrong thing to do. And it's not only does that not work with his mindset at the time, evoking that sentiment is significant because a lot of the anti-intervention movement in America at that time was called the America First movement. And it was very, very strong on Nazi sympathizers and also often bankrolled. It had a lot of people involved who were actually literally funders of Nazi systems. So any sort of leaning towards alluding to that mindset is very much that's a confused, messy situation. That's a genuinely dangerous sentiment to be alluding to. But also, like, it's him lashing out because he's grieving over someone. And, like, he gets really low. He, like, kicks... Like, there's a point where they're trying to discuss an ideological idea. And Steve's just, yeah, well, how's your sex life going? Like, Pepper's not here, is she? You fucker. It's like, whoa, Steve. That's not the language he uses, but like, that's the intent and the tone. Like, he's just trying to.
I think there's also. I think there's two ways to look at it. He's either lashing out there, as I do think he's a lot, because I just said that. But I think there's also. I think they're probably also trying to show that these are still friends and that it's. Even as they're arguing, they're also worried about each other's personal lives. Like, say how Black Widow comes to the church where we had to, where she goes to the church and she's like, "Yeah, I knew we were going to disagree on this, but I didn't want you to be alone." And I feel like there's also elements of seeing like,
yeah, I think Tony approaches Steve with the intent of trying to talk as friends in that scene, and Steve lashes out pretty hard in the first half of that scene. By the end of it, he's leaving as, well, I'm a friend who disagrees. But in the middle there's this moment of genuine anger coming out of Steve. And he then starts to realize that, okay, I'm doing this very wrong right now. And rectifies his actions pretty quickly. But that's there. And that's a side, like that's a very personal, petty side of Steve that we haven't really seen up to this point, which I think is interesting to see coming out.
I like to see it.
But ultimately, this film ends very, very confused and muddled about what it thinks the right thing was to do. And the MCU has very much sidestepped this issue. Because after Civil War, we talked about how it alludes to Black Panther, which was several years later that film actually came out. And so between this and Black Panther, the next films we have are Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which is a space opera, Spider-Man Homecoming, which is a real small-town personal story in just a small area of New York City. Then we have Thor Ragnarok, which is a neon space opera. Then we have Black Panther as the next time we're returning to this sort of setting and world and characters, but it's purely from the perspective of a separate sovereign state. And then we go to Ant-Man and the Wasp is after Infinity War, but I'm bringing that up.
Well, okay, it was released after Infinity War, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so my point is that between Civil War and Infinity War, there's nothing following up these ideas. And so the film just leaves it sitting there a bit confused and awkward. And there's very much this sense from the creative side of it, we don't really have answers to what's being asked here. What is the right way to be handling this sort of situation? And so they just kind of pussyfoot around, avoiding making a film that tries to provide an answer, and then they just go with, well, here's the really, really bad thing, so we've got to act and stop the really, really bad thing anyway.
Yeah. I think, and I guess the most cynical way to look at that is just like, in the end, despite any interesting subjects you can take out of this, in the end, the most important thing is a much more simpler idea of just, at the start of the MCU, we have Tony Stark, who is very, very guilty about the problems that he's caused in the world, or at least has helped proliferate. And now he's constantly trying to make good on that, make a better world. And the failure of him to keep the Avengers together, no matter what this conflict of Civil War was going to be about, the more important thing is he couldn't keep them together. He couldn't keep them together for the most important thing that was going to happen for the Avengers, which was this event with Thanos coming in and attacking. He couldn't keep them together. He couldn't get them to succeed. And that's kind of like the main like fallout from Civil War, unfortunately, instead of the perhaps more interesting subjects of just like how vigilantism works, how a world would work with such superpowered people and how that might change things. So, that's kind of the cynical way of looking at it. Or at least
you want me to get real harsh here?
Well, okay. Sure.
Okay, so on Iron Man 1, we see that Iron Man is a man who is guilty about the things he has done and he tries to rectify them. And over the course of the MCU, he tries many means to try and rectify the damage that his approach caused. And not once did he think that the answer could be demilitarize. Never did he think to do this. Never did he try to implement this. Even when he's getting rid of weapons that he sold, he's making other weapons and he's funding other people who make more weapons. Not once is it, okay, maybe we should be using these powers to drastically reduce the amount of presence that we have anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you can then say, well, what about when Thanos comes? But maybe people would be more equipped to actually discuss and persuade him if they were thinking about things besides how big are the guns that we need to shoot the space people.
Well, either way, however you want to look at it, it's
Shifting that window, mate.
yeah. Either way you want to look at it, it's a man who has his own perspective on things. Tony Stark is who he is, and he's only going to be able to look at things in a certain way, and maybe that's one of the reasons why he wasn't able to keep the Avengers together, and why the Avengers act in certain ways.
Great men of history and shit men of history.
But as I said, that's the cynical way of looking at things. There's another way of looking at things where maybe this is such a hard question of interventionism versus not wanting to exert your will unfairly on others. That is such a difficult one. That the fact that the Russo brothers, who are just movie makers, aren't able to come up with the perfect answer for such a complex question is okay. And maybe just the fact that they were able to make a movie that made us think about it even a little bit is worthy of something, even if they couldn't come up with the answer.
Yeah. That's something I was going to close this segment of the episode on. Is
Apologies.
like, this film does at least start a conversation, and that can be very valuable to have, provided it goes in constructive directions. And maybe not the answer is, well, what if someone comes with a bigger gun? What if there's a giant squid that we can unite to fight?
I think it would have been disappointing. Obviously, I see you're having leanings against Captain America, but I feel like I would have been disappointed if either of them was like proven to be 100% right without any like equivocations whatsoever.
Yeah, I don't think it demonstrates Captain America is 100% right, but I think that the existence of the Thanos construct does lead to the MCU inherently and implying support towards that approach.
But I think I have to admit, like, and this is where comes that confusion.
I mean, that's it's like you're telling superhero stories. There's got to be bad things to fight, and so it's always going to lean in that direction.
Yeah. And also, I have to admit, and this might be a bit embarrassing because we just talked about this movie for like a while now.
50 minutes.
I'm not even entirely sure what Captain America's full position is, and this is where it comes to that confusion and vagueness where and I'm not even sure, as I said, because Tony's position is sign the Accords, and as we were saying, the Accords are so vague. In some ways, the positions of everyone is very, very vague, and you can probably go either way in so many different directions with any of them, really. So, and maybe that's okay because it's a very messy situation.
Yeah, I'm thinking now about various works. It's a particular problem in computer games at the moment, big expensive computer games, to use imagery that has strong political connotations but insist that your text has no political statements. And this film does a better job of trying to make you actually want to think about and discuss things, even if it does back away from drawing its own conclusions directly. So, shall we talk about Doctor Strange?
It's a much less interesting film out of these, but yeah, we might as well, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I'll go with the shortest review that a friend of mine gave, which is this film would probably look pretty sweet on LSD. Tell us the plot of Doctor Strange.
Okay, so Doctor Strange is a movie about a arrogant but very brilliant surgeon who he's extremely arrogant, but he's extremely good. But unfortunately, despite being on top of the world, he's very rich, very popular. He gets into a car accident. It ruins his hands.
I'd specifically say crash, not accident. Like, it's all his fault.
Yeah, it's his fault because he is an arrogant, selfish prick who is just totally enamored with himself. Narcissistic is probably not even...
He looked at fucking screens while driving.
Yeah.
Like, that's an offense.
Yeah. So he gets himself in a car crash, and that ruins his hands. And that ruins his sense of himself, even though he can definitely live his life perfectly fine without his... Well, okay, he has his hands, but they don't coordinate quite as well. They shake. He can't perform surgery anymore. He can't do the thing that he thought he was best at and the thing that he defines himself by. And so in trying to fix his hands, he spends a lot of money, all of his money, in fact. He spends his vast fortune trying to find a cure. And unfortunately, that leads him pretty much nowhere until he follows with no money left. He uses his last little bit to follow a very slim lead in Kathmandu in Nepal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And he finds a strange organization, cult-like almost, who teach him the ways of sorcery and of sorcery. Basically, the idea of what's the word they use again? Like the
astral projection?
astral projection, yeah.
It's a level 9 spell.
It's a level 9 spell. Basically, he's lucks upon a group of sorcerers who teach him the ways of sorcery while also trying to teach him humility and to care about others at the same time. And while he's learning to do this, unfortunately, there is kind of a war brewing between these sorcerers because they're the leader of these sorcerers.
He's like Doctor Strange, but evil Doctor Strange.
Yes.
Who wants to open a portal to the dark dimension.
Yeah, there's unfortunately the Ancient One, who is the leader of this organization of sorcerers, had a prize pupil who turns evil and is evil Doctor Strange, who wants to basically control time, stop time, do something with time.
He wants to be immortal.
He wants to be immortal. He
thinks that selling out Earth to the Dark Dimension will get him
Yes.
immortality.
Dark Dimension and a Dark Lord. So eventually, it's basically just one of those movies where you alternate between a character learning the ways of, in this case, sorcery. There's like a lot of montages of him learning his new abilities, while also this guy called Caecilius tries to destroy the world. And eventually, as always happens, the mentor is eventually killed by the evil one, leading to Doctor Strange having to step up, having to learn a lesson of humility and selflessness, in that he was a selfish, arrogant character while he was a doctor. And now, as he goes through his journey of learning new skills of being a sorcerer, he also learns how to be a better person. And that helps him have a final battle with Caecilius. He eventually stops the evil man and saves the world, while also deciding that he will continue being a sorcerer and safeguarding humanity from mystical threats.
Hooray! How many Scott Derrickson films have you seen?
I do not know who Scott Derrickson is. So.
Scott Derrickson is a horror movie director. Most notable for the films Deliver Us from Evil, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and of course, Hellraiser 5 Inferno, aka the really shit one.
I know of these films, but I have not seen them.
Yeah, he was a big fan of early Doctor Strange comics, and he wound up being one of the people who was in talks with Kevin Feige to direct this. He basically described his interpretation of Doctor Strange, and Feige went, "That's exactly what we want, go make the movie." Okay. To bust out the auteur theory here, this commentary was much more interesting. There's something about the Russo's commentaries that I find just really, really dull, which is probably why I tend to have these real snide quips about them all the time. It's because the more I hear them talk about the way that they see film, the less interesting I find them as people. But Derrickson's was a really interesting one where he's talking about stuff that he tried to do and things. And as it went on, like, I had a very low opinion of him at the start of the commentary, but he actually really expanded and got into more nuanced issues that he had in the creative process and various signifiers that were wound up being used in the film, which came off as kind of cool. I don't think this film is particularly great. This Ant-Man and Captain Marvel, I think, are the definitive 6 out of 10 Marvel Cinematic Universe entertainment products. Where you watch it, you're going to have a pretty good time. You'll smile a bit. You'll see some good people win, and you'll be like, yeah, that's pretty cool. And it's really just saved by its spectacular visual design. Well, where do I go from here in my notes?
Well, I will double and I will give a +1 to visually stunning. If there's anything in this movie that's worth the ticket or worth your time now going to see, it will be those spectacular visuals. It's just not a thing you want to watch on a shitty monitor or on your phone or something like that on a plane.
Yeah, find the biggest TV you can with the best sound, and be captivated by the crazy fractal shit going on.
And it does make sense that this guy was a horror director, because there's a lot of scenes, especially when he starts to
experience magic.
Yeah, which feel very much like a horror experience, especially the kind of movies that you talked about, especially Hellraiser. Really, I was like, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think okay. Do.
And the start of the movie was quite fun. Like, it set up a pretty fun idea. I liked. There's something about this like evil cultist being evil that's just kind of fun. Like,
Oh, the very first scene is great. You get to see some cultists behead a man with some goofy ass devices. It's very cool, and then they just drop it into that bucket. That's fun times.
Bucket? Like, it's just
So you can dispose of the head.
it's
Duh.
it's just such a mundane thing. Like, it's just
You respect the books there. You respect the knowledge. You don't respect the practicality and utility of how they use that knowledge. So you don't want to mess up the books, man. You might need them later.
yeah. It's a shame. If I might say something, I would say that it's really interesting to me that even though it's really just immortality that Caecilius, the bad guy, wants, he talks a lot about time, and there's a lot of talk about time actually throughout this movie.
Which is really just to set up the time stones in it.
Yeah,
I think.
basically. For a movie that talks about time so much, I feel like time is this movie's main enemy because it feels very overstuffed with little things. Even though everything in it is mostly pretty simple and easy to follow, even if something is easy to follow and easy to understand, sometimes it's better to spend some time with it, I think, just to grow some attachment to it.
This is an interesting one to bring up because Scott Derrickson's approach to storytelling, his perspective is you're generally better off telling simple stories with complex characters is the way to go with film. So that way, even though it feels like there's a sense of progression and you're going to go where things are going to go, and you might be able to see that, but if the characters are complicated enough, then you can really get your teeth in and actually care about them. I think one of the big hookups here is early on when Strange has had his crash, and he's lashing out at an ex-girlfriend, and she just goes, okay, like, you are beyond redemption. I have to get out of this relationship now and probably forever. And I really think that she should just be out of the film at that point. There's nothing more here, like, move on, Strange. And the ways that he keeps going back to her is itself fine for demonstrating the ways that he can't let go of a man that he can never be again and shouldn't ever be again. But then it ends with like the implications of a strong romantic reattachment happening as he grows as a person, where it's like really he should be growing into a different relationship with someone else. And that those moments with her should be so, okay, she's just going like, I can operate with you professionally and I can help you here because I'm a good person, but like you need to be out of here, and him being, okay, I do need to be out of here.
Yeah, I guess as a little side note, yeah, I feel like Rachel McAdams gets an incredibly thankless role in this movie. Like, it must be so, I don't know, like, she's probably paid a lot.
She's like Lady in Thor.
Yeah, like, so, you know, I don't want to pity her too much. I'm sure she was paid handsomely for whatever work she did, but it must be a little bit disappointing to be a part of this MCU universe and your character is so dull and has nothing to do with anything that is interesting or cool about this universe at all.
Yeah, like Sylvester Stallone's got a better role in the MCU than she does.
It's so disappointing, and I feel like there's no really way to fix that role because there's nothing really to do with it. So I feel like it should have just been completely downsized and just given maybe to like a lower actress, like someone who's like up and coming or something like that, and just needs like a quick role. Like, this
especially
is
since these films aren't sold on their actors or star power at this point. They're sold purely on the value of the brand.
Yeah. Like, he could have, and I definitely think you're right in that, you could have had him like be like wishing for his old life in other ways than him actually having to go back to the hospital or anything like that. You could have just had him look at pictures. You could have had him acting in similar ways as he did back when he was in the hospital. So the idea of like he hasn't left his ways completely. You could have gotten the idea across without spending lots of screen time back in the hospital, which I think is kind of wasted, especially because with so many different things happening in this film and so many different like ideas being thrown out but very, very quickly, I feel like screen time is like really precious real estate, because you have like, okay, so you've got Strange's journey, which is obviously the most important one, the one between where he's learning to be a
Did you just say
sorceress.
Strange Journey? That's a Shin Megami Tensei game. So now I'm just gonna be thinking of that.
Yeah, like because he has a. I can't think of another word than journey now, unfortunately. But he has that journey between going from a doctor to a sorcerer and also a selfish, arrogant, narcissistic man to a better person. So that's the most important one. It needs a lot of time to get through that. We've also got the Mordo character who has that thing where he's going from someone who fully believes in the organization that they're in, this is of the sorcerers, to someone who believes that sorcerers all need to die. You have an ancient one who has this duality of she is obviously ancient and wise, and also someone who seems like a very, very good person who has only good interests in mind, but she also does a few things and is revealed to have done things in the movie that could be a little bit shady. So that's also interesting. You've got Caecilius himself, who has this thing where he wants to be immortal, but he also talks a lot about time, and you get the feeling that he wants this immortality out of like the pain of losing. There's like a quick mention of the fact that he lost his family. That's why he came to the sorceress in the first place. So you've got all these characters that have things that you can explore. Plus, all like the more greater concepts of like time itself and how sorcery works and who this friggin'
Oh, the lore, that
there's
sweet,
a lot.
sweet lore.
Yeah, there's a lot to go through, and so I feel like when you look at all these things, screen time is at a premium because all these things can be explored and can be quite interesting, but because that they're just kind of thrown out very, very quickly, then none of them really coalesce into something that's interesting.
Yeah, something that was remarked on in the commentary was, like the entire second half of this film was basically a series of action scenes. And I think that's where the problem is. Not that this film lacks time, but that its use is misguided. If there were ever a film in the MCU that could get away with people sitting in rooms talking, it's this one. Because while they're talking, they're learning about magic and also grappling. Like, all these characters are really grappling with grief. And it is through understanding their grief that they're able to get a better understanding of the multiverse. And so that's what the film really needs to be about. But instead, it just goes from these fun studying sequences to just, now there's a fight in New York, then there's a fight in a New York hospital, then there's another fight in New York, then there's a brief moment of respite before you then fight in some New York some more, and then some Hong Kong, and then the movie basically ends. It's just fight, at a point where you could really be coalescing all the characters and really building them, and that's, I think, what causes this problem.
Yeah, I feel like when you talk about movies, or like whether you're critiquing, reviewing, or whatever you want to call it, like there can be a trap you can fall into when you just start rewriting the movie into something completely different. But I can't help but do that a little bit with Doctor Strange, because it feels like there's so many different ways that you could have done this that would be better.
It did the most Hollywood way of doing this, and like I think that audiences would have been more receptive to something better than that.
Like I would have loved the idea of like maybe having an extended kind of what would you call it? Education of Strange and sorcery, as in like really not just in terms of screen time, but also in like actual time, and like you could
That's
really
funny
speed up
because this is actually an increase in the amount of training sequences in comparison to the first test cut. Where the general audience response was, we want to know more about the magic and all that process of Strange's arc. So please put in more of that. And so they actually shot a bunch and put a bunch more in.
The thing is, though, it's like, not that I don't appreciate learning like the ins and outs of how the magic systems work, because that can be fun in its own way, but you can also tie that to like his own journey and also the journey of characters. That. Yeah. Because like I'd imagine if instead of Caecilius already being evil at the start of the film, I think it'd be much more interesting if Caecilius was kind of like a peer to him, and like the idea of them two kind of going on their own separate journeys through learning about how magic works, and like each one kind of having their own idea of what magic will do for them.
Yeah. And then Strange learns acceptance, whereas Caecilius chooses denial, and that's where the conflict kicks in.
Yeah, there's just different ways they could have done this, and it's just a real shame they picked like the simple way to do it.
Well, that's enough about simple things. Shall we get into the complex shit?
What's the complex shit?
Who did they cast to be the leader of the Asian sect?
Benedict Wong, is that the...
No. I was referring to Tilda Swinton.
Oh, sorry.
Shall we get into this shit?
I remember because Benedict Wong was like in charge of the Hong Kong sanctum, which, yeah. Okay, Tilda Swinton, yes.
Oh, yeah, well, let's just... So there's these ideas called Orientalism and exoticism, which refer to the ways that colonial powers did in the periods when they were forming colonies and continue to view Asian cultures as this mysterious, exotic, unknowable other, often with the bent of it being something that's exploitable and sellable. And it tends to lead to this real sense of otherness and that Asians aren't really people. And this also coincides with lots of situations. I think the best and a way better example than this film now is, of course, the live-action Ghost in the Shell, where an iconic character from a Japanese text who is a Japanese character gets played by Scarlett Johansson because Hollywood don't think that people want to see an Asian woman in a leading role. And there's lots of lazy stereotyping that you can do around depictions of Asians in cinema. Big Trouble in Little China is like the classic example of a film that is by a guy who's usually pretty well-intentioned and tries to be well-intentioned by depicting Kurt Russell as the bumbling fool while everyone else is way more competent than him, but also still very heavily leans into a lot of Orientalist stereotyping. And this film, so it's like, there was an anticipated and a very real criticism of like casting a white woman to play the character of the Ancient One. And the reason that Derrickson gave in the commentary was actually quite a good one. He went on these very long discussions of like there is nowhere near enough representation of Asian Americans in American cinema, and we need to be doing better. And also, something that did come up is, since they were actively trying to avoid the traditional comic depictions, which is of the Fu Manchu wise mystic man with the stupid moustache and shit.
They even make fun of that.
He explicitly plays around with that by Strange walks in and assumes the Fu Manchu guy is the master, and that's just a guy. Is then played for another, playing around with his perceptions later on as well anyway. But yeah, so the problem that Derrickson did, because he actually consulted a fair amount of people, like Asian people, like film theorists, critics, and actors and the like, to try and work out what he should do about this. And so the decision to cast a white person was, okay, if we go at this point in time with an Asian woman in this role, an Asian woman who's old, domineering, and has a lot of secrets and damage and things, basically it would kind of, at this point, wind up trading out a Fu Man, in particular with a white person directing it. He's like, okay, if I ditch it but replace it with an Asian woman at this point, instead of using the stereotype of the Fu Manchu, it's going to wind up being the stereotypes of the Dragon Lady. So, which is an even more harmful form of both racial stereotyping and also gender stereotyping. And so it's, okay, I'm going to basically take the lesser of two evils here and just go with the white woman, so I'm at least presenting a woman in a position of power and subverting expectations that way, in a positive way. And that's what he tried to go for. So his initial defenses of his decision came off in the earlier stages of the commentary as from ignorance, but it was clear over the course of it that's, okay, he was actually really thinking about this quite hard, in what is often a difficult situation where you want to do the right thing, but you're in a multi-billion-dollar corporation that's probably not going to necessarily let you do the right thing in the exact right way. And so, like, I'm giving the film like several gold stars for actually trying to do things well.
It helps that Tilda Swinton does a great job in the role that she eventually got after all that long, lengthy process.
Of playing other ageless witches. That feels like that's all I ever see her doing in movies.
She's got a little bit of like, I remember she was much more evil in like The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, but like I really liked how like,
and in Constantine starring Keanu Reeves.
Really, she was in that.
Oh, have you never seen that?
I've seen Constantine, but
yeah,
it's been
she's
so
Gabriel.
Fair enough. But yeah, she's got like this like humorous bent to her that I really enjoy. I really like the part where she starts like showing him like pictures out of like she's initially explaining to him like what sorcery is. And he obviously doesn't believe her at all, but she's essentially trolling him. Like that's what she's doing.
Oh yeah,
she's
just testing him so hard. She's Yoda right there.
Yeah,
in a very different way to Yoda.
Yeah, but just like the smile on her face as she does it. Maybe you like this picture. Yeah, and then eventually, she's not just humorous, but she also has some of the more emotive lines in the film, like when she tells him that it's not all about him in her death sequence, and just the fact that I really like the idea that. Usually for most of those ancient style characters that are like mentors, they usually die with a great deal of dignity. And she does, but usually they're always like completely selfish. They don't talk about themselves at all. They're just like, you now, hero person, must now defeat
You must join the leaderarchy.
Yeah, but instead you can tell that she's really upset that she's going to die. And I think actually that her last words or something like that. Like, I really wish my even now most of my thoughts are now like, maybe I could just stay alive just a little bit longer. You know, that's my main thoughts.
Yeah, I'm prolonging this scene specifically because I don't want to die.
Yeah, exactly. And I really like that kind of, that bent on it. The fact that and it strange enough made her seem even more heroic by the fact that it was very obvious. She didn't want to die. She liked her life, but she had to let it go. And yeah, I quite liked her. And that's probably all I have for Doctor Strange. It's difficult to talk about too much.
It's getting late. We're an hour and 20 minutes in. And yeah, because the film is otherwise such a bog standard 3-act Hollywood story where bad person becomes better person.
And everyone's already talked about Dormammu have come to bargain, I think.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah,
and
it's great. Although this really is one of the most purest adaptations of a Marvel comic story. In that sense, where a lot of these have been just, we've got these broad strokes of character concepts, like Civil War, the previous film we just discussed, was essentially, well, they did this run where it's like, now the heroes have got to fight each other over some idea, so we're going to take that concept and write some other story instead of, like, what if superhero bombs a school? Maybe now Norman Osborn, head of S.H.I.E.L.D., will push forward for superhero registration.
Yeah, that was a trip.
Oh, man. And that's not even the worst thing, to have the Civil War branding in the comics.
Oh, man. Civil War 2 was so dumb.
I'm so glad that I was out of the big two.
I think you were out
when
a
that
long
rolled.
time before that, luckily.
Yes.
Because I wasn't very good.
I got out. I bailed around Siege, man.
So yeah, Civil War, the movie, much better than any Civil War in comics.
But yeah, so the point that I was getting at is that the origin story presented here is very authentic to the way that he's depicted in those early Strange Tales issues. Just, here's this guy who's an asshole and a surgeon, and he goes there. He travels to the Orient, which is itself a lazy colonial trope, but whatever, you gotta work with what you're given, I guess. And learns to become a better person, and then tricks Dormammu into leaving Earth alone permanently, which is then going to give him many, many ways to try and find loopholes to manipulate Earth. I presume if we get a Doctor Strange 2, it'll be like about Shumagorath, the other iconic Doctor Strange villain.
Well, I would hope that it's all about... You're probably right. So yeah, but if it was up to me, it's not. But if it was, I would more like it to be more about Mordo and just trying to explore these characters a little bit more.
And maybe Mordo will try to summon Shumagorath.
No, that would be... Yeah, I guess. We'll have to see.
Have I ever shown you that ending of like Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter where Dalsim has Shumagorath round for tea?
I haven't seen it, but it's been described to me in great detail. It
very
sounds
good.
really good, yeah.
So yeah, it's a fine little adaptation here. I mean, I'm very sad that the MCU hasn't done the cover story from the issue of Strange Tales where Doctor Strange originates, because of course it's the B story in that issue. The main story is a Fantastic Four story. Build, how will the Human Torch defeat the nefarious Asbestos Man? You just see this man in this cheap, crappy grey asbestos suit with googly eyes being ooh, which is of course hilarious now in hindsight, where it's, yeah, Asbestos Man, that's like the most dangerous villain. He's gonna make everyone die of cancer.
Asbestos Man, MODOK. These are the things that you'll never see in any MCU movie.
I kind of feel like Asbestos Man could appear as a throwaway gag in like an Ant-Man movie.
Yeah, Ant-Man, Spider-Man, one of those.
The little guys.
Yeah. I mean, there are obviously TV shows that they could show up in as well, but in
No,
terms
they're
of
not.
the movies.
Not anymore.
Well,
they're all gone.
No, S.H.I.E.L.D. remains. S.H.I.E.L.D. remains strong.
Oh yeah, that wasn't produced by Netflix, so
Yeah.
that one survives. I'm
Yes.
surprised that's still going. How many seasons is it at now?
This will be season 6, I believe.
Okay, so
and
2 more.
Well,
That's the usual TV rule.
yeah.
8 seasons.
8 seasons. Well, they've already got 7. They for some reason renewed it for 2 seasons straight off the bat. So they obviously have plans, which I'll be excited to see. Which is coming. It's coming out pretty soon, so that'll be exciting for me at least.
And yeah, we haven't really talked about the TV components of the MCU because they don't matter at this point. Disney's canned them all as part of their bid to prepare for their big streaming service launch, which will be a disaster because Disney is really bad at digital services. They have a really, really bad track record here. So I have very, very low expectations for when it inevitably happens. It'll probably be quite damaging to their brand integrity even.
Yeah,
But then again, so was Iron Fist.
I do feel like maybe at some point after we do all these movies, it might be worth spending 10, 20 minutes talking about the TV shows at some length, just because it is a part of the MCU technically.
Oh, the Ant-Man and the Wasp episode, since we don't have a movie to tie that with yet.
Yeah.
So does that mean that'll be the give me the lore dump? What happened in TV during this period? And
could
all
be.
the time.
It could be. We'll have to find out, I guess.
Will Agent Coulson finally return in the movies? I mean, he returned in Captain Marvel, but that predates all the others.
Either way.
We're beating around the bush here, so I think it's probably time to cut this off. Doctor Strange, it's alright.
If you have a good TV, maybe watch it.
I didn't bring the list with me, so I'll make sure to bring it next week. And then we can update the list with the last few episodes worth. So next week is Guardians 2 and Spider-Man Homecoming, I believe.
That's correct.
That'll be fun. Those are good movies.
Well,
We'll see how you feel about Volume 2 this time.
as maybe a precursor, because I've generally said that I've enjoyed these movies. Guns of the Galaxy 2 I did not enjoy too much, so that could be something interesting for next podcast to see if I feel the same.
Well, this time it'll be not a movie. It won't be the construct that you're expecting, is the key thing here, I think, with Volume 2. You know what the film is, and so maybe you'll be looking at different things in that film. Yeah, but yeah, Homecoming, that's cool. Birdman 4.
Homecoming, very exciting.
Birdman 4 is coming.
Birdman 4 is coming. One of the best villains in Marvel is coming.
Yes,
and a really good
that's
movie
right.
as well.
Kurt Russell is coming. Good night, everybody.
Good night.